month's Gender Research and Action in the Global South seminar. These seminars run monthly and look to draw from diverse backgrounds and countries of expertise to create a space to discuss research on gender in relation to environment, development, and beyond, in the hopes that we can have an honest dialogue of both the successes in gender research and practice, as well as the risks and challenges. They're hosted by three of us from the University of Oxford who focus on gender: Marina Korzenevica, a postdoctoral researcher in human geography; Maria Hillersland, a research officer at the Oxford Department of International Development; and myself, a but humble DPhil candidate in geography. Today's session will begin with a 30-minute presentation by our presenter, Dr. Meinzen-Dick, who I will introduce soon, and then be followed by a Q&A session. We ask that you please send your questions in the comments section as Dr. Meinzen-Dick presents, which we will then sort by topic if needed for the Q&A session. We'll then give you the opportunity to ask your questions directly, or you can have us ask it on your behalf. And now to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Ruth Meinzen-Dick. Dr. Meinzen-Dick has over 25 years experience in transdisciplinary research and is the author of over 150 peer-reviewed publications based on various research areas. These areas include how institutions and policies affect the way people manage natural resources, especially land and water; gender issues in agriculture, with a focus on gender differences in control over assets; and the impact of agricultural research on poverty. Dr. Meinzen-Dick is the coordinator of the CIGAR, Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, program on collective action and property rights, co-leader of IFPRI's, the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI's research theme on strengthening institutions and governance, and in 2019 was awarded the Eleanor Ostrom Award on Collective Governance of the Commons for her scholarship, research, and work with the Commons, communities, and pro-Commons policies. Ruth, I'll now leave it to you to present, and thank you very much and best of luck.
Thank you very much. That's great. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. What I hope to do right now is get my screen open right, first of all. I was really delighted by this invitation, and especially in talking with Maria, that she said it was okay to be a bit reflective in this seminar. So instead of trying to present things like I have all the answers, I'm going to mostly give you thoughts and experiences and invite your reflections as well. Because in one way, I feel that there's been so much, and a lot of my focus today is going to be on the qualitative quantitative interface, which I think is really important in a lot of gender research. I feel like there's been a lot of progress in getting qual and quant together, but I also have some concerns that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So first, I'm going to give you a bit of my background. I grew up in India. I did anthropology work in high school and undergrad, switched to development sociology at Cornell, but have a lot of economics training. And then at Cornell, it was very interdisciplinary. At the time, interdisciplinarity was valued. And then now I'm at IFPRI since my days as a postdoc, doing applied research, starting out on how people manage natural resources, then on to other things. And gender has been, you know, a theme with varying prominence throughout this time. Not always a focal point, but there. Theoretically, I would say, you know, I used to say interdisciplinary, then now transdisciplinary. Various kinds of influences from scholarship, from Weber and Marx to political ecology, and also a lot of quantitative work. But a relevant aspect is that I'm also a fan of mysteries, of detectives that notice things multisensorily and put those pieces of information together to solve problems. So in going through this, I'm going to give you a bit of my history with qual quant research using 3 examples. Then I'm going to show you a tool I've used for trying to integrate methods, and then go over some of the tensions between the methods and using a Nepal example that Cheryl Doss and Rajendra Pradhan and Audrey Pereira and I have been involved in. Instead of conclusions, I'm going to end with some musings and invite your thoughts. So the first example of where I was at IFPRI really able to bring together qual and quant work was in the CAPRI program on collective action and property rights. We wanted, first of all, the idea was we wanted one article on methods for studying collective action. Then we realized that in order to get there, we needed to hear from experts in these different approaches. So we brought together people who did surveys and large N case studies where you collect comparable data from 50 to 100 communities so that you can do some quantitative analysis on it as well. Qualitative studies that were research as well as action research that was intended to strengthen collective action, and experimental games. And given the sniping I had heard between qual and quant research, I was expecting blood on the floor. Instead, it was one of the most amazing workshops. Part of it was where we held it. It was at Aberdare in Kenya. And, we could sit out under the trees when we were doing it. I think an important part was that we had a field trip on like day 3, where we went to see how these things played out, remind ourselves how it plays out in the field. So Pauline Peters, an anthropologist, and Juan Camilo Cardenas, economist who does games there. And then it helped that we had bonfires and sitting out and lots of time for bonding. Second example is a study of the impact of agricultural research on poverty that Michelle Adato and I led with 5 case studies on this that were qual and quant. What were the factors for success? The first was that there was a donor invitation. As in DFID said, we're not going to fund this unless there is qualitative and quantitative. And related to that, we had a workshop that brought together these various experts. We also used the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework as an integrating framework. We had an advisory group with experts from those different perspectives there. So we had Robert Chambers from IDS, not the economist, but Jerry Behrman, the economist, and Tony Bebbington, a geographer, who had used both techniques. And sometimes they argued it out, but after a couple of meetings, Robert Chambers and Jerry Behrman started completing each other's sentences. So they were really supportive of this. We also had a separate budget for the qualitative research. So the qualitative wasn't always a beggar. And then in a couple of the best cases, the qualitative was answering puzzles that had been raised in previous survey analyses. Now coming to some really exciting, more recent opportunity to developing the project level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or ProWEA, where we had really intentional use of qual and quant. In developing the original WEA, we had some qualitative work, but in developing the project level, we were working with 13 development projects, and we developed some qualitative protocols, and I see Dee Rubin is on the line here, and some others. We developed those qualitative protocols that each project would use. They could adapt it, but then we weren't able to get the qualitative work from all of them before we developed the index, but we were able to actually do some analysis of at least 5 of the qualitative studies from both South Asia and Africa. And there were common elements that the big takeaways summary of some of the EMIC studies. In particular, I found the point about empowerment of women being relational to be very interesting. And that doesn't always sit well with some Northern notions of what it means to be empowered. And even in some of the African cases, empowerment was translated as emancipated. So, but this did contribute to the development of the index. For example, even in the WEA, based on this, we had determined that either individual or joint assets, individual or joint decision-making would be considered as empowered. So when we developed the other important point out of the EMIC, out of the qualitative work, was that in no case was women's empowerment seen as a good thing if it meant power over somebody else. And so when we developed the WEA, we had intrinsic agency, collective agency, and instrumental agency, but there is no coercive agency in this because of that. Okay, so it wasn't perfectly integrated because some cases the qualitative came before the quantitative, other cases they were going at the same time, but so that's another area. However, I have used in a number of projects and studies, I've developed what I call the data matrix as a method, as an attempt to integrate the methods. So you don't have just the qualitative over here and the quantitative over here separate. Now, the matrix, there's not a great science behind it, but just in the first set of columns, it's like, what's your broad research question? How do you break that down into subtopics and even, if you want, variables? And then the other columns are the types of methods you might use. And reminding people, this is taken from a training I did for another thing, where reminding people that there can be secondary data that you're using, qualitative or quantitative, secondary document analysis or secondary data like LSMS and administrative data. And then you've got primary data, direct observation, household or individual surveys, face-to-face phone surveys, and then qualitative data. A lot of times when I hear qualitative, people just mean key informant interviews or focus groups, but reminding that there can be a number of other things. And I would sort of say that spatial data is almost a separate category where you can use participatory mapping and remote sensing or diagrams that capture things a little differently. And then you go through and you say, for each of these subtopics or variables, where would we get the data from? And, you know, what's like, you could get it from lots of places. What's the most important place to get it? And then when you're developing your survey, you go down the column of the surveys and you say, okay, these are the things we need to make sure we cover. And similarly, you know, the protocol, the qualitative protocols, the guidelines. So that's just one of the techniques I've used for trying to integrate them. When I do that, sometimes I get nervous. I know we're supposed to triangulate, but what happens if they disagree? If I have information from, you know, two different places and they give me a different picture. That's not always comfortable, but it can be a creative tension. And I want to give you an example from a study that I mentioned with Cheryl Doss and Rajendra Pradhan and Audrey Pereira. This was in Nepal, an impact assessment of a heifer international goat project that used the original Women's Empowerment in Ag Index survey data and really detailed ethnographic data, not just key informant and focus groups, but village resident, you know, man and a woman qualitative researchers in the village, originally to be there for 6 months. That had to be shortened. But when there have been qualitative papers and quantitative papers, but when we decided to bring these together, we got inconsistencies, puzzles, tensions on two major areas. One is on the results on caste, and the other on social position in the household. Now, first, I want to say that this study, it was a great pleasure to know that I was working with really top-notch qualitative and quantitative researchers. Rajendra Pradhan is an anthropologist, one of the most thorough researchers I've ever worked with. And he trained the qualitative researchers who were collecting the data as well. And then Cheryl, I've worked with her for a long time, and Audrey, really thorough in the quant analysis. So when these weren't agreeing, it wasn't easy to say just, oh, well, that data was badly collected. Oh, and by the way, the survey firm or the organization that collected the survey was also really high quality. So when they didn't agree, you couldn't just dismiss it and say it's a mistake. And in particular, in the qualitative work and throughout the literature, there's a strong thing that the patriarchal norms are stronger in higher castes, and higher caste women are more likely to be disempowered by this. But the quantitative data showed pretty clearly that high caste women, Brahmin and Kshatri, were significantly more likely to be empowered than the other castes. And we had different caste categories, you know, Dalits and Janajatis and such. When we probed into it a little bit more, which particular indicators of disempowerment were strongest differed by caste. But for example, Dalits' workload was a big area of disempowerment. Now, what this led us to is, you know, emphasizing that disempowerment may come from poverty as well as patriarchy. And that has really important implications for both measurement and for programming. So, you know, this has been one of the insights. The mother-in-law versus daughter-in-law. Again, we have really clear qualitative evidence from our study as well as the literature and even folk songs that daughter-in-laws have really are very disempowered, and mother-in-laws are queen of the heap, so to speak. And in particular on workload, the daughter-in-law narratives talk about dukkha, or suffering, and what a heavy workload they have. We could never take food by ourselves, had to work very hard to plant corn, break earth, and so on. But my mother-in-law was never satisfied. I did whatever she ordered me to do, went where she asked me to go. I was never allowed to go where I wanted. I was never allowed to do what I wanted. And then another, as daughter-in-law, we are supposed to do what they, the parents-in-law, tell us to do. Over to the quantitative data, if you look at the total hours worked, there's no significant difference. Yes, daughter-in-law's average is slightly higher, but it's not significant. When you look in more depth, the mother-in-laws are doing significantly more productive work hours, and the daughter-in-laws, the reproductive, the cooking and caring versus the economic activities, if you will. So what we're seeing, and when I went to visit one of the field sites, when we were staying with an extended family, you could see that the daughter-in-law was doing the cooking and such, and the mother-in-law was threshing the ragi. And they were both working on tending the goats, so this. Now, how do you reconcile this? Well, one of the things this leads us to is to say it's not the empowerment issue, may not be the hours worked, which is what's in the WEA and pro-WEA, but it's the issue of agency over time, the extent to which you control your time. And, this is consistent with a lot of the literature on worker satisfaction as well. It's the amount to which they control their own time. And we're seeing a lot of that in, the issues of during the pandemic as well. So to end on some reflections and musings, ideally, you'd want to iterate between qualitative and quantitative. In practice, time and budget constraints usually limit that. And that's the reality. What does help is if you can develop multiple projects over time. So for example, actually even Nepal, we have some layers of projects, and in Bangladesh and some of these. So that's one thing to think about. The other point I want to make is that there is a real value in the tensions between them. Sometimes one or the other can help resolve a question that's raised. So when people were wondering why the nutrition of households that were growing vegetable gardens were not better than the nutritional outcomes for the neighboring households that were not growing the gardens, the qualitative work found that the people with vegetables were sharing them with their neighbors, not selling them, so it wouldn't have shown up in the income, but they were sharing them as a gift, and that was creating that was valued as creating social capital, for example. But as I say, from the Nepal, there's, even when they disagree, you can, if you push through that. Over time, where I'm sitting at least, I feel like there is a growing acceptance of the legitimacy of qualitative research. And that's because I've mostly been around a lot of quantitative who early on most quantitative didn't accept qualitative. But I also found that there's a lot of qualitative people who don't accept the validity of quantitative research. So I think there's growing acceptance of the value of both perspectives. But the issue that I want to raise is that this legitimacy of qualitative research seems to be derived from qualitative research being more like hard sciences. It's reproducible. And in particular, it's legitimate because it can be put into a computer and analyzed. And you can have intercoder reliability checks. And so, but by putting it into the computer, that's often at the expense of the depth and contextual knowledge. I don't know of any, I mean, it's transcripts that get put into the computer, not an observation, or rarely observations about the body language that people were saying, or, you know, the smells in a house, or, you know, these other kinds of things, or just the contextual knowledge that the qualitative researchers who collect the data often have. And so my other point was on the importance of respect. I think to work through these values of tensions, you really have to respect each other. And all of the best examples I have of that are where we may have disagreed, but we respected each other's skills and all. I'm quite disturbed by this decontextualization of qualitative data, because I used to think that qualitative data was the one place. Surveys have long been accused of take the data and run, that northern organizations pay for a study, design it, the data is collected, and then it's analyzed back in the global north at the university or whatever, and the often without collaborative co-authorship from the countries that are collecting it. Qualitative research, I would have said, is harder for that to happen because you need really skilled qualitative researchers to collect the data, and they have to know the language, and therefore you're getting, you know, and one of the things I keep having to advise people is, no, you know, your qualitative researchers are going to be expensive because you have to get somebody with skilled training, not a high school graduate as an enumerator for your, who can collect your survey in a kind of remote, rote manner. But what's happening is you get the translation and a transcription and plug it into a computer, and, you know, I've seen recently, then that can be analyzed without the contextual knowledge. So I would just like to reiterate that we need, in order to really capitalize on this, and especially for gender issues, we need to contextual knowledge, and we need collaborators from the place who can argue with us if we're making sweeping generalizations or are missing something. So it's not a comfortable thing for me, because I look at some of my publication and they don't always have a co-author from the country that I'm writing about. Mostly I try to, but so this is just some of the musings I've had as I was preparing for this. And so I'd like to see what the rest of you think about, and happy to go over any of these things. And I realize I walked through them fast. Let you choose what you'd like to pick up on in the discussion. So thank you. And this is a list of the publications that I'm mentioning here. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. That was really interesting, and I'm sure there will be quite a bit of discussion coming up in a second. We do have a couple of questions to be asked. I think I'll start with my little one first. So I'm a DPhil student, and you're talking about sort of using these qualitative and quantitative methods together. And it seems to me, from what you've said, there's quite a lot of, you need quite a few resources to be able to do this well. So when we're operating with limited resources, what are your opinions on, do you sort of do both, moderately well and blend them together, or do you try to focus on one more than the other? I'm not sure if that's
yeah.
any ideas. Sorry.
Maybe it depends on where you are in or what the question is, obviously, and where it is in terms of how well understood it is. Because the more you're going into something that isn't really well understood, I think investing in the qualitative is important. The quantitative has the great advantage of being able to say, how widespread is that pattern? So you can have like the narrative of the evil mother-in-law, which is from TV and all these other things, and it's a trope, but it may not be that widespread. Or you can have, so these are some of the, I think it was important to have the quantitative in that case, to pick up on that. So I'm weaseling on that, I realize.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I'll apply that to my work.
Yeah.
So we do have another question. We've got one from Florence, who's just looking for you to go into a bit more detail about how we deal with the contradictions between quantitative and qualitative data. And also, sorry, just before you answer, just like to remind people to enter your questions into the chat box, so we can keep asking you questions. Sorry. Thanks, Ruth.
That's great. That's great. Thanks. No, that's a really good question, which is always the answer I give when I don't have a really good answer, because it's a challenging question. First thing I do usually is to check whether there's a mistake from one or the other. And that happens. So if it's the quantitative, I might look, one of my professors just advised always to actually look at the distribution of your data, see whether it's, all these kinds of checks that you do. But then if like in Nepal, if you're pretty sure that both are sound to the best of their abilities, then look at whether they're actually addressing quite the same thing. So that's what led us to looking at time agency. So, and realizing that and I would say that we've done the best. My colleagues who developed the time units on the WEA and ProWEA have used best practice for quantitative methods, but they're still not capturing, it's really hard to capture the effort of work. How the mother-in-law may be assigning the daughter-in-law to be doing the heavier lifting. So look at whether they are really measuring the same thing. Where are they coming at it from slightly different questions, and does that give you a new insight? So,
Cool, thank you. So another question, talking about the sort of the generalization of a lot of this work. So quant is typically sort of argued to be a lot more easy to be adaptable across sort of contexts, whereas qualitative work is typically much more sort of context specific and really in the nitty gritty. When you combine the two, how do you what are your sort of thoughts about the generalization of combined qual and quant work?
so I think one of the things that a number of my colleagues, so two things. One is that when you have a really good quant sampling frame, and also especially if you have prior data, you can sample your qualitative. And I think one of the challenges of there's a lot of sloppy qualitative research out there. One of the most egregious is the convenience sample. We're going to show up and whatever 10 people come, that's going to be our focus group, and not necessarily noting whether these are all the elites, or thinking about, who is speaking in there, all the sampling problems. So having the quant and linking that to the sample is really helpful. However, I had thought that best practice would be, especially if you have the survey data on somebody, then you could sample, and some places are doing this, you then sample empowered and disempowered women, and try to go into more of their life history, or how the project has been affecting them, or why they aren't able to participate, all that. There's a value in that. But Rajendra Pradhan, for example, when we said that's how we should sample for the life histories in Nepal, he said, look, this has already been a long survey. The people who've done that may not have the time to do a life history, and also the life history, you need the right person. And I was totally convinced, because then I went along to a life history survey for a woman who just clearly did not want to open up. And that wasn't going to go anywhere. So we could have just done the thing, but we wouldn't have gotten anything. I think it's one of the things I guess also to keep in mind with the sampling is everybody has biases. And in fact, this comes back to the value of reading mysteries, is you realize nobody is necessarily telling the truth in either a survey or in qualitative, but you look in, I think qualitative, you look for their biases and more explicitly. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm being told we are getting millions of questions. So
Okay.
this is
Sorry, I'll
good.
try to be quicker then.
Oh, no, that's fine. You're doing very well. So another question we're getting is, you talked earlier about transdisciplinary versus interdisciplinary. What's really the difference in your context of doing research in gender?
Uh, um, so, I mean, the way I have explained it to people, and I don't know whether this is the way everybody else uses it, is that the interdisciplinary is you're drawing from multiple disciplines in order to get a publication or to, to do a more academic analysis. Transdisciplinary is bringing them together in order to solve problems. It's got a more interventionist orientation. And so for a lot of people, that is the gender transformative work. And I guess a lot of our work in developing the WEA and especially the project level WEA, we're doing more than measurement, but the intention is that by measuring this, projects can identify what are the main areas of disempowerment so that they can tailor their interventions more effectively. And so that's where another colleague, Corinne Valdivia, has started using the term from medicine of translational research. So,
yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next one. So this is sort of coming from a few different sort of perspectives. Essentially, the question is looking at, as a quantitative researcher, how, as someone who sort of, is based very much in the quantitative area and doesn't maybe necessarily look so deeply at the nitty gritty of social issues, how do you integrate qualitative approaches into your work? And then as a qualitative researcher, someone's mentioned that they've seen quantitative people almost abuse the qualitative research process and sort of bring qualitative people in to impress the funders and, sort of just please people. How do you sort of advise the qualitative researcher to be a part of that process?
So to address the latter part, my advice to quantitative or to researchers who are just trying to bring in the qualitative is that this isn't, qualitative research is too often seen as the cheap alternative. And then, I'm saying, no, go for the very best qualitative researcher you can find. That's going to be expensive. Sometimes by the time they've really spent money on it, they will use it more effectively. But this is where they're only going to, if they're really involving the qualitative researchers in the whole process of analysis. But come back to the first part of it. I was thinking about the answer to the second part, the first part of the question.
Sorry, so the first part of the question was, how does someone who's got this quantitative background integrate qualitative approaches effectively?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not even, first of all, to the extent possible, have, and maybe even make it possible, that you're involving people from the country with good contextual knowledge in the design of your surveys. from the beginning. We're now doing a lot of also cognitive interviewing to not just survey pre-test, but actually on the survey, asking a set of questions and then coming back and saying, now, can you tell me, can you translate that in, put that question in your own words? What were you thinking about? Was it hard to answer this information? So doing some qualitative probing even about the survey. But the reason I mentioned early on in the design, we, when we were implementing the WEA survey in Nepal, the survey firm there, or the Oregon Institute that did the survey, was wonderful, really competent. But then the qualitative researchers were presenting, and the quantitative lead from the US was there, and the qualitative people were talking about how for women there are different categories of assets, and one is a household asset, there's dowry, and there's pewa. And pewa is something that is given into the hand of the bride, or there's a special category, and that's a woman's asset. And my colleague who led the survey said, did we capture that in the survey? No, because we were just asking them to translate the survey, and we were using so we asked who owns the asset, but we didn't ask specifically, is this dowry or pewa, which has different implications that would have been quite relevant. But we were asking to translate the survey, not adapt the survey. So I think that's and I wrestle with this because a lot of our studies, we are trying deliberately to collect the WEA or the pro-WEA data across contexts, and we don't want things totally redefined. So that's the tension you get into. I don't have easy answers.
That's very good. They're tough questions, tough to answer on the spot. So next up, we have a question. Somebody would like to ask their question personally. So Karen Grohn, the former Global Director for Gender at the World Bank and world-renowned gender economist, would like to ask a question. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Ruth, for these wonderful reflections, really thought-provoking. And I can't resist, just on your last point, I think you're absolutely right, but maybe the way to handle that is kind of an agreed upon minimum set that don't get changed, and then the flexibility to do the interpretation according to context, because you do need for pro-WEA or a-WEA or whatever, a certain amount of things. So there's probably a hybrid or a compromise solution. But what I wanted to ask you about is actually something that maybe you're not prepared to talk about, but which I think you raised that's extremely interesting. And it goes to staying in the issue of empowerment or agency. I was really intrigued by your comments about time, and fully agree. You know, the issue is control over time, and the issue of how agency status can change. And I'm wondering, based on your thinking about this, how should we begin to think about measuring agency in a dynamic context? Because of course, as we know, agency can be expressed in different ways in multiple domains. Sometimes there's no agency, sometimes there is quote unquote full agency. But also when you think about the temporal aspect, it makes it much more complicated. So do you think about like a way of adapting self-efficacy measures over time? How are you starting to think about this now? I think this would be a real value to those of us who are thinking about measuring women's empowerment.
Oh boy. I'm looking at a couple of the lists, folks on the participants list, and Hazel, any of the rest of you working on this? feel free to chime in and answer that, because but one of the things is it's not an adequate answer to your question, but one of the things goes back to that point about empowerment being relational. And what that means differs across different points in your life cycle, right? So for a daughter-in-law, the relations are much more complex than for the wife, you know, of a nuclear household. But it's still relational because then you have children and all. So I think we need to bring the life cycle into the way we think about women's empowerment. And what it means for me to have agency over my time was quite different when my kids were little versus now, when, you know, so yeah. But are you saying, let me try to get this into a bit of your thoughts on it too, because are you saying that even the expectations of agency might increase over time? So yeah, I think we have dealt with that in a lot of the sensitivity testing on the WEA and pro-WEA measures, because if you set a threshold, and you know this from when you were involved in working on the WEA, if we set a threshold at a certain point, everybody in some countries would be empowered, but if you set it much higher, everybody in some other countries would be disempowered. And one thing we are doing, working with Catherine Yount of Emory, they're doing psychometric testing to try to get questions that show sensitivity across a broader range of degrees of empowerment. So that's one technique on that.
Hi, Ruth. Sorry.
So that's okay. Yeah.
I was meaning
Please.
to jump in, but yeah, the baby. Speaking of multitasking,
Yes.
and yeah, the baby wanted to weigh in about time control over time. I just to add to Karen asked about dynamics and change over time, and I just wanted to say that one of the things we're trying to test is exactly how these measures sort of change at end line. So so far, you know, the paper we have on pro-WEA has used are really based on baseline analysis, and the end lines for the projects are just coming in. So this has been kind of on our to-do list to see how these different indicators change over time. It's taken a while to kind of get that data, because basically we had to wait, right, until we get to end line, and even for the original Feed the Future end lines, that has also taken quite a bit of time. So hopefully we will have an answer on that soon, but you know, now that you know, end lines have come in, but so maybe by end of the year or by early next year, we should have more to say on that. So basically the approach is to look at, you know, try to get at multiple observations across time and across space, and see how the indicators perform, both the old indicators, but also now we're trying some of these new control over time questions that are still in the very kind of early stages of analysis. All right, I think that my time's up. Sorry.
What a perfect illustration of all of this, Hazel.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think we're about out of time for questions, unfortunately. But thank you, Ruth, very much for your presentation today. It's much appreciated. And thank you, Hazel, for coming in as well, and the child.
Yeah. Can I raise one thing from D. Rubin, that responding to Karen's question, the relational component isn't only the intra-household, but the individual and household and the broader set of institutions in which they're embedded. And that's really important, especially going back to that poverty and patriarchy, because if we only focus on the household, we're only going to see the patriarchy aspects of disempowerment. But there are broader structures that may be disempowering men and women. So yeah, that's
good. A good note to finish on. Thank you very much. So once again, thank you very much, Ruth, for presenting today. It's much appreciated. I'm sure everyone here gained quite a lot from it. So for everyone else here, we'll be having a short holiday throughout August, but our next seminar, when I get my screen up to share, will be in September, on September 10, at a time that's yet to be decided. Still coming up, sorry about that. So Dr. Leith Dunn will be presenting. Here we go. Dr. Leith Dunn will be presenting on the topic of gender and environmental justice. So Dr. Dunn was named among the top 100, most influential persons globally in the areas of gender policy and equality in 2019. And so it's not a presentation to be missed. So finally, I'd like to once again say thank you very much to Dr. Meinzen-Dick and to everyone for attending. And we look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thank you all very much.
Unshared.